Welcome to Women Leaders in Church History, which there's a lot of content. So I really felt like I had to zero in on a specific topic because there are so many women leaders in the Bible, and there's so much to discuss. So before we get going, I know most of you, but wanted to share a little bit about me and kind of a little bit about how this topic came to mind for me when Matt asked me to do a talk. So my husband Cody and I joined this church in 2018. Have really enjoyed being a part of the St. Andrew community. I am currently on session and also currently the preschool, kindergarten, Sunday school teacher. And so we'll talk a little bit about roles in the church. And so nice to be dipping into both of those buckets. And I'll just ask, honestly, for grace during this talk. I went to school for pharmacy, not theology. I did take one undergrad theology course, so we'll see if that from 2010 really comes back to mind here. And then really kind of why this topic. So when I grew up, I went to a non-denominational evangelical church, and really, while I have great memories, great community, really the thing there was, women cannot rule over a man. Women cannot teach men. Women have specific roles within the church. And so I really found, over the last 20 some years, trying to see where do I personally fit into the church, but also understanding church history and understanding what does the Bible really say about this? What does Paul say about it? What did Jesus say about it? What happened in the Old Testament? And really, over the course of those couple of decades, kind of finding my place in Christianity. So all of that information does not fit into 50 minutes. So we are really going to focus in here on specifically women in the early church. However, and I love that someone knows what this is. If you want another bonus story about women in more later church history, specifically the 1600s, you can look up Jenny Geddes, who is a Protestant heroine from Scotland, and this is a memorial marker for her in Edinburgh, and she threw this chair at her pastor. Google it to find out why. Well, that's not the moral of this talk, but it is a very interesting story. Helen Bryce clued me into that little tidbit of church history. Yeah, sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. Yes. So there were some Presbyterian women who destroyed a chair a few years ago by hucking it repeatedly into Helen's yard. So the legend lives on. So I want to start with, frankly, to me, really sums up Paul's thoughts on how churches should function, right? That there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither is there man or woman, but you are all one in Christ Jesus. And so that's in his letter to the Galatians. And so really, we'll talk about this kind of as we go through, but during that time, obviously there were gender differences, but even more so were there class differences, and how that really plays into who is able to lead a church, how the church was able to organize. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with just some misconceptions, some things that aren't really supported by the biblical text and just are kind of out there, and things that people might assume. We'll chat a little bit about Jesus' ministry and kind of how that sets up the early Christian church. And then we're specifically going to go into 5 different women and talk about what they did to contribute to the early Christian church. If we have time, I put kind of some notes together on some translational choices and how the Bible becomes a thing, how we get where we are, how we get an English Bible. But if not, we can send the slides out as well. So let's start with some misconceptions. So misconception number 1, this was something that I heard sometimes growing up, was, really if there were women involved in Jesus' ministry, they would be there. You would see them acting in the same ways that Christ does. You would see their names listed, amongst the disciples and things like that. They are in there. So there's about 180 women mentioned by name in the New Testament, and that is not even counting nameless women, like the women at the well, women in parables, all of those types of things where more, kind of an unnamed women, that when we actually look at individuals, it's about 180 in there. So we're not going to talk about all of them. The other thing, and this really kind of blew my mind when I read this, and I always thought this was odd. So if you look at, Matthew 14, you have different tellings of the feeding of the 5,000, the loaves of fishes. I always thought this was so weird that we say Jesus feeds the 5,000. It says the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, and then also some women and some kids were there. So it wasn't 5,000, it was more than that, and why aren't we counting them? And really, that's how they did it in the first century. That was what was expected, and that was, I think, even more key. That's what everyone else who's reading this assumes, that they assume you list the number of men, and then they're all doing the math to say, oh, and then also there'd probably be about this many women and children. That's not how we operate today. So if I heard there were 5,000 there, I would assume humans. So I think that's what is really key here. And when you, read and listen to people who work on Bible translations, thinking about how would the original audience have read this, and how can we then be intentional about putting those numbers and names back in, and knowing kind of how to read between the lines to know where women are in these stories. So hopefully that debunks that misconception. The other misconception, and this was probably the one that I had to wrestle with the most, was that this idea of women as leaders, it has to be really modern. It has to be really progressive. It's all like women's lib and like all this stuff. It's a political movement. That's not true, because already in the 1st and 2nd century, women are being mocked for being such prominent parts of Christianity, that this was already a cultural movement. And so I always think it's kind of interesting to get sources outside the Bible that can verify what we hear from the writers of the Bible. And so here we have Celsus, so AD 175, that he says, Christianity, like, they're in these private homes, it's all being run by women, really, we Greco-Romans, like, we're masculine in this Christianity thing, too many ladies. So already, again, so not a novel concept, right? This is 2,000 years ago. Pliny the Younger, I don't know, does anybody know Pliny the Elder as well? He's kind of popular in medicine, some wild thoughts about how people should cure different things right around, he was more AD 30, but Pliny the Younger, so his nephew, and again, prolific writer, so we know a ton about these two guys. He specifically has a bunch of correspondence going back and forth with Emperor Trajan, and is basically saying, this Christianity thing, it's really getting out of hand. There's a lot going on. I can get some people to say they're not Christians, but some people are like, no, you can't make me recant. And so he basically talks about these two women who, according to him, are leaders, are deaconesses in the church. He tortures them and then says, yeah, they really seem to be in on this Christianity thing. So again, I think if this was just kind of lip service that Paul is giving to these churches in the Bible, you would not have these external sources saying, man, these ladies are really shaking things up. They're really leading. They seem to be important. They seem to be leading people in their homes. Next misconception, that there's certain places for women and certain places for men. That there are places that women should be, such as the home, such as the Sunday school room, and there are places that women should not be, such as leading a company, leading in the military, and leading in, that boardroom where the elders are sitting. And so what we see in the Bible is that that's not the case in the early church. So we're going to talk about Phoebe. We're going to talk about Phoebe traveling hundreds of miles to be Paul's messenger, and that's in Romans. We're going to talk about Junia, who is seen as a political enemy by non-Christians, is persecuted for her faith, and we'll talk a little bit about her stay in prison. That comes from Romans. And then kind of to go back a little further, again, just to represent this idea that this is not novel, we see Deborah in the Old Testament as a prophet, as a judge. She's, regarded as mother over Israel. And so she works as a magistrate, so almost more of a governor than we think of as like an actual judicial person. And so she actually, the commander of the army says, Deborah, come along to battle. This is where we need you. We need you as our prophet. And really, as a result of her actions, she ushers in 40 years of peace for Israel. And so we see that in Judges 4 and 5. Really some interesting actual parallels between her song of rejoicing after this battle and Mary's Magnificat and praising, Jesus Christ coming, God's deliverance, and the parallels there are really interesting. So that could be a whole other hour talk, but we're not going to do that. So really thinking, hopefully through this talk, kind of debunking those misconceptions, and we're going to jump into just a couple thoughts on Jesus' ministry and how that really tees up life in the early church. So Jesus' ministry. Hopefully this is not news to you guys, but Jesus was actively engaged and welcoming to women. And that was countercultural at the time. So again, not a new concept to us today. What we see is that women traveled with Jesus and actually were some of the people who were really helping to fund his ministry. And so in Luke 8, we see some called by name, specifically Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and quote, many others. So again, there we have our unnamed women. Those are not counted in our 180. And that these women were helping to support them out of their own means, right? So we'll talk a little bit about what life looked like kind of in that first century and how we think of it as a true patriarchal society. And so it's easy for us to say, well, there were no women's rights, so women couldn't do anything. They couldn't have money, they couldn't go places on their own. And that's actually not true. It really, the structure was actually a lot more complicated than just man-woman. You have landowning men and women, you have former slaves, you have slaves. And so you think about, a woman who has a household and has societal status and has wealth, much higher status in the Greco-Roman world compared to maybe a man who's a freed slave. And so again, not endorsing that class structure, but that's the reality there, that we do have women that are independent, that are wealthy, that can travel independently, and were frankly, by definition, disciples of Christ and following in his ministry. One thing that I love, and I pulled this out, this was not my primary reference for this talk, the Spark Children's Bible, but I just wanted to point out to say, I am thrilled that there are little girls in my Sunday school class that hopefully will not have to answer these same questions, because what we see in the story about Jesus calling his disciples, Jesus and his 12 friends, the disciples, shared the workload with many other followers, including Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna. No matter where Jesus went, Jesus called for men, women, boys, and girls to drop what they were doing and follow him. And so I just think naming those women is so important, even right from the start, to say they were there. The other point that I think is so interesting, I don't know about you guys, but I remember, different Good Friday services throughout my life talking about and hearing about the disciples left Jesus. Jesus was all alone on the cross. The 12 fled. And that's true. However, the women stayed. And we see that in multiple gospels, that we see that the women who followed Christ did stay. And so I think there's something that's lost when we only kind of have tunnel vision for those 12, of some of the virtues of courage, of resistance, that we have to look at that whole picture to really determine who is involved in Jesus' ministry. And so what we see as well, and I think this is the most powerful point, is Jesus really invests in and trusts women with the gospel witness following the resurrection, right? That is who Jesus showed up to first. If Jesus was a savvy political maneuverer and was just looking for power, looking for a way to spread the word, he would not have selected women likely. But that was not his motivation. His motivation really was to bring everyone together. And we see that then later in some of Paul's letters about that egalitarian approach. So moving on past that, we are going into early Christian church leadership. And to me, this is really where still we hear echoes of the same words that we use to call our church leaders. We talk about how we set up a church, what the leadership structure should look like, how people should be participating with one another. And that's all coming a lot of this from the Acts of the Apostles as well as from the letters from Paul. And so, does anybody know who this person is? You can kind of see her here. Phoebe, we're going to talk about Phoebe. She was someone I had never heard of until being an adult. So let's do better, everybody. So first we're going to talk about Junia the Apostle, because she really crosses the bridge from Jesus' ministry into the early church. And so we see Paul's words in Romans. Again, I'm going to assume that Paul wrote Romans. Most people think that. Great Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. So Junia is known to be a woman through the early church, and up through the Middle Ages was really known that Junia was a woman's name, and this was a woman. And we even see some frankly kind of misogynistic theologians and translators who are like, it's weird, but that's what it is, how odd. But she's an apostle, and continuing to use the phrase among the apostles, and continuing to use her name as written, which is Junia. However, what we see is kind of around the Middle Ages, we see this thought of kind of reverse engineering this passage, that the thought was, yeah, but like women can't be apostles, so we must have gotten it wrong, because this can't be right. This can't be what it meant. So they started calling her Junius, even though that name is not found in any other writing of the time and is not a common male name. There is, lots of documentation around Junia being a common female name at that time. And so translators really made a choice to fit the narrative of that time. How could you say women can't be priests, women can't be deacons, and this point would be what do we now consider the Catholic Church, and then have Junia exist? Well, that's not gonna work. So they changed it. And so, maybe they're brothers, maybe they're friends. Nope, Junia is a woman. So when you really go back and look at that text, you can see where those origins are. And so really, nearly all English translations do cite Junia as a man from essentially the 1940s through the 1970s. And so I'm thinking about the people who taught me the Bibles that I owned, 1940s to 1970s, right? When were your Sunday school teachers around? When did you get your first Bible? And so this has been very much a tough thing to walk back. And I'll talk about this at the end, but I think it's so interesting. This book has been really transformative to me in understanding how to read the Bible. So it's called What is the Bible by Rob Bell. Our Bible study book group did it. And it really helped me understand this English Standard Version that I have. It did not get handed down directly from heaven to my bookshelf, right? Humans had to touch this. Humans had to determine how to make things from one language to another, right? Has anyone ever taken a foreign language class or speaks another language? They are not a one-to-one, right? You have to make choices. And in a lot of cases, people went in with the best intent, and in some cases, they came in with an agenda. So Paul refers to many people outside of those traditional 12 apostles, including himself, right? He makes a really good case to say, it wasn't a hard stop after 12. I'm there too, guys. And then he lists multiple other people. He lists Matthias, he lists Barnabas, he lists Andronicus and Junia, he lists Titus, he lists James, the brother of Jesus, he lists Epaphroditus in Philippians. And so according to Paul, the definition of an apostle is someone who is a firsthand witness to Christ's earthly ministry and then became a missionary of the gospel. And so we know from his definition in all these other instances that is who Andronicus and Junia were, that they were people who were living life with Jesus on earth, seeing his earthly ministry, and then going out to spread the gospel and relocating themselves. We also know from this passage that Junia and her husband were imprisoned by the Romans. We don't know for sure if they were physically with Paul in prison, or if they were both imprisoned simultaneously in different places, or if they were imprisoned at different points in time. But we know at some point, all three of them in prison in a similar state. I did some reading on what prison life is like at this time in Rome. People were not put in prison for petty crimes, for things like theft. These are serious offenses, particularly for a woman, that a woman will be much more likely to be on house arrest or be kind of turned over to the men in her family to be dealt with. And really Paul's language. So this book, which is called Tell Her Story, How Women Led, Taught, and Ministered in the Early Church, really went into quite a bit about what prison was like and how Paul chose specific words. The word he uses is, we say have been in prison, kind of like passive language. The word he chooses really evokes more of this thought of a prisoner of war, that she is there because she is a threat to the establishment, and that these are two key leaders in Christianity's spiritual battle. Prisons were atrocious. They were often deadly. So again, we see kind of outside of the Bible, we see Libanius, AD 314 to 392. He writes that no one comes out of prison, though many go in. And really they see regular beatings, overcrowding, dampness, chains that would often cut into the flesh, result in significant infections. And these people had not gone to court yet. This was sort of a place of holding people who were kind of the worst of the worst because they could not be let out into society. And they weren't serving kind of sentences, just kind of whenever they felt like things had died down and they could maybe let you back out. So that's the situation, truly that Junia finds herself. And so despite all of these atrocities that, again, as Paul is saying, it happened in the past tense, she is continuing her work. So she risks a possible return to that same situation and continues to engage in ministry. And so now this is the world according to Emily. I think that's probably why Paul regards her so highly, right? He has been through this. He knows how bad it is as a guy. And Junia went through the same thing as a woman. And again, men and women cohabitated in prison. There was no women's prison. So think about that for a little bit and what that would entail. And so despite the option to, kind of continue her ministry, but maybe in a private home and maybe just to women, no, she continues to be a key figure in God's ministry. She's called out in the letter to the Romans. And really thinking about the time frame there that Paul specifically says they were in Christ before I was, and seeing that she likely was in more of a mentor or an elder role to Paul, someone he could turn to for advice, someone he could rely on for guidance, because he's seeing them as sort of those more senior members of Christianity, which is crazy thinking about Paul, that it's like, oh, that's the big dog, but that he had people that he relied on as well. There's a really great article from an organization called CBE International, or Christians for Biblical Equality. Great website. They have a great podcast. I'm going to put kind of some images at the end. But this talks about Junia the apostle, and just a really good discussion of her life. And then I think this is what's hard. We don't know the end of her story, right? Did she go to prison again? Did she die in prison? Did she, where did their lives take them? It sounds like they continue to travel as missionaries. But, truly, I would imagine that her courage really shone through to the end. Next one, and this is the beefiest, right? That was like a pretty small text about Junia. Who's heard of Priscilla or Prisca? Yeah. So some translation as Prisca, which was probably a more formal name, right? Like that might be like James, but she went by Jim or Jimmy. So same thing with Priscilla being kind of a nicknamey version of Prisca, and her husband Aquila. So I'm not going to read through every single one of these because we're going to talk about them later, but essentially we see in Acts 18, we see a lot of information about what Priscilla and Aquila were up to. We see them mentoring someone named Apollos. We see them traveling all over the place and kind of at the same rate that Paul is. Same thing here, we see them come up again In 1 Corinthians, we see the churches in the province of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in the Lord, and so does the church that meets at their house. We see greet Priscilla and Aquila, my coworkers in Christ Jesus. They have risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles feel grateful to them. Greet also the church that meets in their house. Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus, and that's in 2 Timothy. So this is spanning geography and time throughout the early church, right? Like these are all different locations, and same with Timothy as Paul's writing to him. And so what we see is this is truly a prominent couple in the early church. They're well known to Paul. Apparently they bailed Paul out of some sort of sticky situation because he credits not only their work to save him, but also their work to save what would be the future church of all non-Jews. What is really interesting, and theologians and translators point this out, is the ordering of the names is very important in text of that day. So traditionally, you would say Aquila and Priscilla, greet them, greet their house church. That's in most instances, again, out of the 5 times they're mentioned, 4 of those, Priscilla's name comes first. And so likely she is the more active leader and has a more active role in ministry. The other thing that I love about them is that it seems as though they're taking a specific interest in potential leaders. They're detecting a lack of knowledge in others, in their knowledge of the gospel message. They're mentoring them, they're teaching them. We see the journey of Apollos, joining them in their home, really coming alongside him to see he's eager, he's willing, he has a story to tell, but he's just not quite ready for the prime time, not totally clear on the concept. He was all about Jesus' baptism, but he didn't really super know what happened after that. So he needed a little mentorship there. And they're small business owners. So they're tent makers, same as Paul's background. But this really enabled them to move from city to city and fund their own ministry. So they have, essentially the financial success and stability to lead a house church. Yet they're not wealthy elites, but they have the means. And what we know from other house churches is that you then become kind of the default leaders for folks that you're bringing into your home. So really kind of the model as ministers to work their trade, to earn enough money and support themselves while still dedicating their time to the church, right? At this point, we don't have full-time head pastors that are being, called into ministry. You have people who are making enough to get by and spend the rest of their time making a church. They also move several times for ministry work and really give up the comfort of being settled, giving up the community that they have, that they've fostered, they've invested time in these leaders, and then they pick up and they go somewhere else. And that would be so hard. But they really demonstrate the importance of prioritizing the growth of future leaders. Again, inviting Apollos, really, and again, the verbs that are used and the nouns that are used, we see that Priscilla is likely the one that is really taking the time to mentor Apollos and deepen his understanding of Christ and the gospel. So has anyone heard of this gal, Nympha? Yeah, so there's so many people in here and we just do not talk about them, right? Like I've heard of Silas, I've heard of Barnabas, like same level. And yet I had not heard of these people until reading some of these books. So she is kind of dubbed the most important early Christian leader you've never heard of. And so we see her name come up in Colossians. So give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea and to Nympha, the church in her house. After this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read to the church of the Laodiceans, and that you in turn read the letter to Laodicea. So, so Colossia, Hierapolis, Laodicea, all in the Lycus Valley. So they're all kind of close together, and Paul wants them to share correspondence because they're all hanging out. It's basically the North Liberty, Coralville, Iowa City of the Lycus Valley. And so we have Colossians, right? We have Colossians in our Bible. Where's the book of Laodiceans? We don't have that letter. So we don't know what was said to Nympha. We do know that they were supposed to be sharing those correspondence, that likely because they're in the same geographic area, maybe they're struggling with some of the same things. But so really, we know the only church leader we know from that town is Nympha. So she is the main leader. She's leading a church in her own home. So we know possibly widowed. It seems this is not their home. This is not Nympha and Joe New Testament home. This is her house. And so, what we see there is we see that early church leaders, needed a very specific skill set of gifts. They needed the experience as a leader. They needed the resources as a leader. And so what we see from this call out in Colossians is that Nympha had all of those things and was doing this independently. What we don't know is a whole lot else about her. I think it would be so interesting to be able to read that letter and see what she was supposed to be doing to improve her church in Laodicea. Tryphena and Tryphosa. Anybody heard of those gals? Likely sisters. So we see in Romans, greet Tryphena and Tryphosa, those women who work hard in the Lord. So again, Paul is writing a letter to the Romans. He is specifically calling out people that he knows in this church because he's not going himself. He has not met most of these people. And so he's specifically calling out people that he does know who have done great work to kind of build that credibility. And so Paul's letter specifically calls them out again for their hard work for the Lord. I'm not going to try to say this Greek word, but the Greek word that Paul uses, and it's up there, implies honorable toil for the sake of the gospel or the Christian community. And so Paul could have picked a lot of verbs, things like, more passive verbs that they're there, that they're doing the work. But the word that we translate working hard, this is the same context that in other texts outside the Bible really describes manual labor, really toiling with something physically difficult. And so Paul uses it in other letters talking about the hard work of ministry, and he uses it to describe himself in other passages, that he's truly just out there grinding it out because it is tough. And so these are not, he would not use that if they were doing ladies' work, right? They were in the kitchen, in the nursery, which again, preschool, Sunday school teacher, that's hard work too. But the fact that Paul is using those same verb to describe himself and to describe Tryphena and Tryphosa, we can think about the type of work that they're engaged in. So they're likely sisters engaged in ministry that really takes commitment, that takes courage, that takes resilience based on the way that Paul's talking about it. The other thing that kind of comes along with this verb and how Paul uses it in other texts is that it likely involves significant risk, that this is something that is a risk being posed to the individual that's taking this action. And so you have Paul, who is literally, really the apostle to the Gentiles. He's sending this letter to the Romans, and he specifically knew of these two women and wanted to call them out for that publicly. So again, another pair that we don't know a ton about, but clearly renowned in their time. Phoebe, we do know a lot about. So this one again, we're back to a more juicy text. And so, who's heard of Phoebe? Yes. So Phoebe specifically, what we learn about her is mostly from Romans 16. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church of Cenchrea. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. The thing that I always thought, number one, I didn't think much about Phoebe because it really never came up. The second thing that I didn't think much about is the fact I anticipated Phoebe as sort of a mailman, right? Phoebe gets a letter, Phoebe gets on the bus, Phoebe wanders down to Rome, hands some other guy the letter and says, mission accomplished, right? That was my thought. That's actually not how this worked in the first century. So Paul trusts Phoebe, number one, travel hundreds of miles, specifically because we know where she came from and we know where Rome is, to take his letter from the Romans and not only that, but to share that content with his church. And so I couldn't have said this any better, so I'm just going to read this to you. This is from an author who publishes on CBE International, but she says, Phoebe did not just carry Paul's letter, she delivered it. Punctuation had not been invented yet. I did not know that. And that did not indicate how text should be read. So couriers typically read letters aloud to the recipients. They would mimic the author's tone of voice and facial expressions. Phoebe would have likely rehearsed the letter with Paul, noting where he spoke with sarcasm or with sadness, where he rolls his eyes or flashed with intensity. This was especially important because Paul had not yet visited the Christians in Rome. So they would not know anything about how he spoke, how he communicated. And so really selecting this person was vitally important. You didn't just find somebody, oh, you're going to Rome? When are you going? Oh, I'm gonna send this with you, just hand it off when you get there. That is not what was happening. This was Paul's proxy that he trusted to deliver this message.
Like selecting words.
Exactly. That they want, it was not just the text, right? It was how it was delivered, how it was communicated. Like I would just love, I can picture that in my mind's eye of them rehearsing and practicing and Paul reading it and her reading it. The other thing that I think is really interesting, the average letter of the time was relatively short. Parchment was expensive. It was expensive to write. Not everyone could write. Not everyone could read. This letter was 82 times longer than the average letter. And so it likely cost, if we were to do that today, that would be like sending an email that's valued at $2,000 to $3,000. And so you think about, sending in your taxes. I don't know if anybody does that non-digitally anymore, but like really wanting to make sure that gets there. And would you spend $3,000 to make sure that that got delivered? And if you were already spending that, wouldn't you want that person to be someone you trust and someone that you know can do the job? And so really of the time, you needed a trusted ally. You needed someone who could explain complex theological issues to both men and women, right? I think it'd be one thing to say, oh, Phoebe was a great leader in women's ministries or in children's ministries, but that's not what we see here. We see the entire community of Christians in Rome. Phoebe likely had high social standing and a high financial status, considering that she is deemed a benefactor, or kind of another word could sort of be patron of Paul, and quote, many people, right? So I thought this was interesting that really social class could outrank gender in the Greco-Roman world. And so at that time, about 30% of landowners were women, right? Likely widowed. There was also a certain type of marriage where a woman would not be under her husband, but she would actually still remain legally under her father's household. So there's all sorts of different ways that this happened. This is not to say that first century Rome was some sort of egalitarian, just paradise. No. However, the concept that women can't do anything, can't own anything was just false, because we do see, again, in sources outside of biblical text that women were landowners, women were heads of household. So some translators do use the word deacon or minister for the Greek word diakonos when referring to men. And some of them use that same word to translate as servant when referring to Phoebe. And so that went on for a good long while. Again, kind of around that same time that we see Junia all of a sudden being referred to as a man for a good chunk of time. Paul never makes that distinction. He uses the exact same verb to refer to men, to refer to Phoebe, and never says, but kind of in a different way. Paul is using that word to inform the Romans that Phoebe holds an official titled position in her church, and that means she's been vetted to preach and to teach, and that's why they should take her word now that she's at this other church. So Paul is using that not to be nice, not to be saying like, oh, she's so great, she's such a good, such a great gal, she's so helpful. No, she has this specific position and needs to be trusted as she is trusted at her home church. So just to wrap up on Phoebe, that she is a teacher, she's a preacher, she's a respected leader of her local church. And she really, this is again, we think about Priscilla and Aquila, we think about Phoebe being settled, being well respected in one situation, and choosing to leave that to support the broader church mission. That she sees where she's needed by the Roman Christian community and by Paul, and she goes. And I think that's pretty powerful. So I want to follow up with a quote. This is from Nijay Gupta, who wrote this book, which is fabulous. I'd be happy to loan it to anybody. Also has an audiobook, which is how I consume most of my media. But he says, Phoebe serves us today as a model of the generous leader, one who, though blessed with many gifts, pours them out for the greater good, benefiting needy people and advancing the greater gospel mission. Definitely someone to emulate. So really just want to close with some early church leadership conclusions. So I think sometimes, as with anything, we pick and choose different verses in the Bible to fit our own agenda. I really think the most powerful thing to see is, how did Paul view the church? And so here's really just 3 things that I think, looking at how Paul talked about, how Paul interacted with these women. The main theme through all of these letters is that Paul preached harmony between men and women, both in the home and in the church. One thing that I think is so helpful in this book, What is the Bible?, that really changed how I think about scripture, is talking about the incremental progress that God is making. I think a great example of that he specifically uses is talking about Abraham and Isaac, and talking about how child sacrifice was the norm at that time, and how God could not come down. Well, he could. I don't know that it would work out great. God can do whatever he wants, but that it would not have logically been appropriate to hand down some sort of message to say, no more child sacrifice. Also, women should vote, and here's how, we should structure democracy, and here's this. We did, there's not even a concept for that. Can't even picture what that would look like. Example that Dr. Gupta uses is talking about his kid going through cancer treatment, and talking about the horrors of chemotherapy, and saying, this is what my child needed. However, I hope that there is something that I can't even fathom in the future. And yet, this is what's necessary in this moment. And so seeing God work incrementally through millennia, and I think we see that with Paul. Yeah, wouldn't it be great if Paul was like, and he did say no, no difference between man and woman, slave or free. Wouldn't it be great if he overthrew the government and made everything a utopia? That was not his prerogative. Instead, he relies on women leaders as coworkers. He demonstrates how that can look. He talks about how men and women can interact in the home with a mutual mission. And I think what's most important is, even though there's churches to this day that say women can't, they did in the early church. Deborah did. And what we see with Paul is that he did not see any deficiency in intellect and skill and morality of women that we sometimes see kind of called out in other venues. So really, I think the takeaway is, our churches are healthiest when everyone can use their God-given gifts, right? And not based on gender, right? There are people in our church who are suited to being on session, who are suited to be on deacons, who are suited to teach preschool Sunday school. And those are not going to be all the same people, and that's not going to be based on their gender, right? Think about what Paul did. Thought about experience. He thought about resources. He thought about their individual skills. And so what's interesting is, the Eastern Church, kind of more Orthodox traditions, do really venerate Saint Junia as an apostle. So I wanted to kind of close with that. And then, so some resources. I kind of mentioned these. This was really a great book, very readable. I really enjoyed the way he kind of walked through storytelling of women leaders, but then does conclude with, and I kind of modeled. I thought this was a very logical progression. So I sort of modeled this talk after this process. Closed with kind of answering some "what about" questions at the end, which was really insightful as well. I want to thank Reverend Lynn Baker Dooley, who really is my aunt and a mentor, and someone who, when I was in a time in my faith to really think like, I don't know if this is for me, this does not seem to reflect the things I value, for her to really come alongside me and teach me some of these stories, which frankly, changed my life. Again, what is the Bible? And then CBE International, as well as their Mutuality Matters podcast. Really interesting stuff. They do a quarterly magazine. They have an academic publication as well. And then, as I mentioned, you'd think that I couldn't, read or write, but I do consume almost all of my media auditorily while I'm driving in my car. And so the podcast is really insightful as well. And they do different themes with their different hosts, some on translation, some on women of the Bible, some on, current issues. And so it's very interesting. And so I know we're past Valentine's Day, but I thought this was a great Valentine. Dear Valentine, I'll never forget you, unlike how the entire church forgot I was a female apostle. So we're coming up on time. I saved this stuff at the end, but I'm happy to kind of open for questions and discussions. What other women leaders speak to you guys? Or was any of this new information?
Definitely a lot of it was new.
Yeah. That was exactly where I was at too, that it was like I wouldn't have been able to name these women very long ago. And that's what was fun in prepping for this talk, because initially I was like, just all of the ladies, like that'll fill an hour. And as I really dug into it, I was like, oh man, like I'm really gonna have to narrow down, because Paul specifically mentions a lot of people. I didn't even dig into what's going on really during Jesus' ministry or the Old Testament. That there are so many women, that just like don't come to the forefront. So it's like, I didn't even talk about Lydia because it's like, there's no time. CBE has some really interesting articles on that, and I am more and more so in that boat of like, I wish, again, the translation thing, I wish English had a way to communicate gender neutral pronouns. And we see that in letters to Timothy too, of and this was a mutuality podcast that I listened to. It was so good. And this translator's just talking about this verse, talking about church leadership. He, them, he. And the translator goes, there's not a single male pronoun in the Greek, just so you guys know. Like, that's not there. I can read that, and it's not there. And this was in reference to church leadership, not to God. But I was like, what? That's crazy. Yeah, like language is so limiting. Honestly, that would be a great talk for next year, not by me, but for someone to talk about Bible translation and how did we get to this? How did we get here? And I think this book talks about that a little bit, which again, just helped me there's so much politics and baggage and history that goes into that. So I feel like kind of owning up to that and knowing what this book is and what it isn't has helped my faith immensely, because I think you see things and you think, how could my God say that? Well, a human said that, and a human translated it, and how does it fit into that broader context? And I think, tell you what to think. Yes. And so I'll just click through this, but we talk in 1 Timothy, we see quiet submission. She must be quiet. It's a little different than The Voice, so kudos to that. I'd never heard of The Voice before Pastor Carl. But what we see, again, talking about translation, this is a specific critique to a specific church. These women were essentially abusing the men in the church to say, we've got a little power for a variety of reasons that history can tell us, and we're taken over, and we're overpowering you. And again, Paul is seeking this egalitarian situation and uses this word again, authenteo, not a word used otherwhere, does not mean to rule, but means an abusive dictator type power. Very negative, is not used anywhere else in the Bible, and yet I don't know, what verb do we use? Assume authority. That sounds very, very neutral, when really it is, don't be an abusive dictator, which I would agree with. Yeah. Oh, I just am at the end. Yeah, can go back to my Valentine. That's so great though, and to demystify some of that early on. I think that's the thing, we gloss over things, and that's often the core of one's spiritual formation is Sunday school. Yeah. Yep. Thanks for joining me. I hope this was interesting. Thanks for coming.